exploration. As anyone who knows Jill knows, she is not prone to stray away from controversial topics. And once she's picked a controversial topic here, especially controversial, I think, is the way she is defining or redefining male and female. I was a little wary when she said, I'm going to define male as having people having a certain power, and I'm going to define female as people who lack that. And I said, oh, you mean like defective? So we'll see what you think of that. But she has put a huge amount of work into this, reading on philosophy to get into this topic, but also learning a lot of biology, a lot of normal biology, and a lot of abnormal biology. I've spent more time than I ever thought I would talking about strange genitalia in women. So, buckle up for the next 30 minutes. I hope we have a very lively Q&A.
Advisor I could have asked for. You stuck with me throughout the whole process, and this couldn't have happened without you. Thank you, Dr. Grove, for being my second reader, and Dr. Jeff for being my third panelist. I'd also like to thank Dr. Pete McCullough for introducing the topic of disorders and sex development to our class over a year ago. I would never have picked this if it weren't for him, and he's basically been a second advisor to me throughout this whole process. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Thank you, Jesus, for bringing us here today. Please help me to speak eloquently and truthfully. Thank you for all the gifts you've given us, especially the gifts of our lives and of our sexuality as men and women. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Amen. In the late 1900s, the International Olympic Committee controversially required gender testing for their athletes trying to compete in female races to ensure that biological males weren't competing against biological females. Now, in 1985, a Spanish Olympic hurdler, Maria Jose Ramirez Patino, failed to pass her gender test due to the presence of XY chromosomes in her cells, which are typical of men. As a result, the Olympics encouraged her to fake an injury so that the real cause of her disqualification was hidden, but she refused. She competed anyway, won the hurling competition, and as a result was publicly disqualified, and her condition was made known to everyone. In quote 1, she explained, I was expelled from our athlete's residence. My sports scholarship was revoked, and my running times were erased from my country's athletics records. I felt ashamed and embarrassed. I lost friends, my fiance, hope, and energy. But I knew that I was a woman and that my genetic difference gave me no unfair physical advantage. I could hardly pretend to be a man. I have breasts and a vagina. I never cheated. 3 years later, with the help of geneticists and coaches, Patino was readmitted to try out for the next Olympics. Those 3 years, however, were 3 years too long for her body, and she failed to qualify in the tryout race by 10/100ths of a second, and she never competed in the Olympics again. Patino suffers from one of many conditions which some scientists and philosophers are labeling as intersex, a third sex in between male and female. And instead of being rare, one very influential scientist, Anne Fausto Sterling, suggests that nearly 2% of the population could actually be neither men nor women. However, should intersex really be posited as a third sex option? What does it truly mean to be a man or a woman biologically? And why is everyone so confused about it? Answering this question is extremely important because it is the root of every other issue regarding the sexes. And while it would be wrong to simply reduce what it means to be male or female to our biology, it is in fact our biology that is the foundation of what makes us a man or a woman. So, to answer this question, we will begin by going over a somewhat tedious but absolutely necessary overview of sex development in utero. Then we will look at some definitions that have been proposed of male and female based on that development. After that, we'll look at some of the ways in which abnormal sex development can occur, and look at some of the definitions that have been proposed to compensate for them. Lastly, we will evaluate the accuracy of all of these definitions based on the criteria of simplicity and sufficiency to determine whether the sex binary can be retained. So, to begin, all of our bodies are made up of cells. All of our cells contain chromosomes. Chromosomes contain DNA, and DNA contain genes. And genes are basically instructions for telling the cell what to do. Now, every cell in our body has 23 pairs of chromosomes, except for the sex cells, the sperm and the egg. They only have 23 chromosomes, period, implying that there is within them a tendency to join with the gamete or the sex cell of the opposite sex to complete the act of human reproduction. So, sperm joins egg, baby zygote, single cell, human person, with a complete set of 23 pairs of chromosomes, half from each of the parents. Now, each set of chromosomes is identical, AA, BB, CC, DD, except for the 23rd pair of the sex chromosomes. They can be either XX or XY, depending on whether the sperm that fertilized the egg was an X sperm or a Y sperm. In our chromosomal composition, we will refer to as our karyotype. Now, remember how we said chromosomes contain DNA, and DNA contain genes, and genes are instructions for telling the cells what to do. Now, there's a very important gene on the Y chromosome that tells the cells to develop in the masculine way. This is called the sex-determining region on the Y chromosome, or the SRY gene. This gene is absent from XX chromosomes. And this we will refer to as our genotype. So, all of this happens at the moment of conception. And for the next 6 weeks, regardless of karyotype or genotype, embryonic development is identical. The organ which will eventually become either testes or ovaries is, for those first 6 weeks, the same bipotential gonad that will differentiate based on the presence or absence of the SRY gene. So if the SRY gene is present, the bipotential gonad will differentiate into testes. If it is absent, they will develop into ovaries. These are our gonads. Now, the primary function of the gonads is to produce gametes or sex cells. However, in order to do that, the gonads need to produce hormones and respond to those hormones so that the hormones can stimulate gamete production. The hormone that testes primarily produces is testosterone. And the hormone that ovaries primarily produce is estrogen. These are our hormones. Now, not only do the gonads need to produce hormones, but they need to respond to them. So, if testosterone, let's say, is shaped like a circle, then the testes need to have cell receptors on the cells that are also shaped like circles to properly receive that testosterone. That also applies to the ovaries with estrogen. Are necessary. Now, it is only under the presence of the proper hormone and the proper cell receptors that the testes will produce sperm, and the ovaries will produce eggs. These are our sex cells or gametes. And it is also for the same reason that the genitalia develop to be either male or female. And our genitalia is what we look like on the outside, so we'll call that our phenotype. Okay, awesome. Thank you for sticking with me. That was a lot. So, based on this development, there's been many ways that people have defined what it means to be male or female. First, we will look at a quote from Aristotle in quote 2, who, although he didn't know the ins and outs of all these processes, I think came up with some pretty good definitions. In quote 2, he says, by a male animal, we mean that which generates in another, and by female, that which generates in itself. The male is that which can concoct and form and discharge a semen, but the female is that which receives the semen but cannot form it or discharge it. So Aristotle defines male and female by gamete production when he refers to semen, and by phenotype when he refers to method of generation. So this is how Aristotle defines them. Next, we have quote 3 from the philosopher William Newton's recent article. He says, I understand a female human to be a human individual who has the active potency to develop the organ needed to produce ova, or eggs, and a male human to be a human individual who has the active potency to develop the organ needed to produce and deliver sperm. So, William Newton defines what it means to be a man or a woman by gametes, but also by gonads, and he refers to the organs needed to produce the gametes. So this is William Newton's definition. Lastly, in quote 4, we have a definition from Anne Fausto Sterling, who is that very influential scientist who thinks intersex is a third sex. In quote 4, she says, we define the typical male as someone with an XY chromosomal composition and testes located within the scrotal sac. The typical female has 2 X chromosomes, functional ovaries, which ensure feminizing puberty, oviducts connecting to a uterus, cervix, and vaginal canal, inner and outer vaginal lips, and a clitoris, which at birth ranges in size from 0.02 to 0.85 centimeters. That was a mouthful. So Anne Fausto Sterling defines what it means to be male or female by karyotype, and she refers to chromosomal composition, to gonads, and she refers to testes and ovaries, indirectly to gametes, and she says that the ovaries need to be functional, and also to phenotype. So she's got 4 qualifications. So ultimately, all of these definitions are sufficient for explaining typical male and female development. However, they are insufficient for explaining atypical male and female development. And so perhaps the simplicity of the sex binary may need to be rejected in order to suffice for these abnormal development. However, before we go into all the ways, well, not all the ways, a couple of ways, that development can go wrong, I'd like to provide a brief defense of why the binary is the best method of classification for human sex. Referring to quote 5, Isaac Newton describes the principle of Occam's razor. He says, we are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. In other words, if we have 2 definitions of the same natural thing, one of which is simpler, but both of which are sufficient, we should always go with the simpler one. The simplest way to describe human sex is based on the purpose of having distinct sexes in the first place, reproduction. All that is necessary for reproduction is a single sperm cell and a single egg. So, since there are only 2 gametes, the simplest way to describe sex would be using a binary. Additionally, as soon as we say intersex is a third sex, that opens the door to saying there might be an infinite spectrum of sexes. Because there's not just one way that you can be intersex. So, before we potentially open the door to an infinite spectrum of sexes, we have a duty to retain the binary as best as we can. So, keeping that in mind, let's go into a couple of the ways that sex development can happen abnormally. First, on the karyotype level, you can have extra or missing chromosomes, XY zygotes, in a condition known as Superman syndrome, extra Y chromosome. They can also have a condition known as Klinefelter syndrome, where they have an extra X chromosome. XX zygotes can have triple X syndrome, or Turner syndrome, where they are missing a chromosome, O being the placeholder for that missing chromosome. Genotypically, you can have a condition known as Sawyer syndrome, where an XY zygote lacks the SRY gene. As a result, ovaries will develop and female differentiation will occur. Next, you can also have XX chromosomes that have an abnormal copy of the SRY gene on them. As a result, they will develop testes and go down the male path. Next, gonadically, you can have an extremely rare condition in which you have a single testis on one side and a single ovary on the other. Alternately, you can have ovotesticular dysgenesis, where you have both ovarian and testicular tissue in each gonad. Hormonally, you can have testes that produce not enough testosterone. As a result, they would have low sperm count and smaller genitalia. On the other hand, ovaries can produce too much testosterone. They would result in female infertility and an enlarged genitalia. Lastly, you can have Maria Patino's condition, which is on the cell receptor level. So remember how we said that if testosterone is shaped like a circle, the cell receptors in the testes also need to be circular shaped so that the testosterone can be properly received and signal sperm production in the cells. However, instead of being shaped like circles, Maria Patino cell receptors are shaped like triangles. As a result, her condition is known as complete androgen insensitivity syndrome because testosterone is an androgen to which she is insensitive. As a result, she has no potential to produce either sperm or eggs, and she develops female genitalia. So, it is completely reasonable that the binary should be at least questioned, because it seems that the simplicity of the binary needs to be rejected in order to suffice for all of these conditions. Let's look at a couple of ways people have tried to do that. Quote 6 is from Anne Fausto Sterling. She says, "We define intersexual as an individual who deviates from the Platonic ideal of physical dimorphism at the chromosomal, genital, gonadal, or hormonal levels. It is based on this definition that she estimates 1.7% of the population is intersex. And for her, anything in red would be an intersex condition." Next, let's look at a more conservative definition of intersex from Leonard Sachs in quote 7. He fundamentally agrees with Fausto Sterling that intersex is a third sex, that it is negligible since it only applies to 0.02% of the population, because he defines it this way. A more comprehensive, yet still clinically useful definition of intersex would include those conditions in which A, the phenotype, is not easily classifiable as either male or female, or B, chromosomal sex is inconsistent with phenotypic sex. Although this definition is more compelling, I think both Fausto Sterling and Leonard Sachs' definitions are ultimately unnecessary and inaccurate, and that the simplicity of the binary can be retained by altering the previous definitions of male and female. First, let's answer the two definitions of intersex. So referring to Fausto Sterling's definition, my treatment of hers is fundamentally Aristotle's treatment of privation. Quote 8, Sons of Metaphysics says, "Negation means just the absence of the thing in question, while in privation there is also employed an underlying nature of which the privation is asserted." Aristotle's privation is essentially Fausto Sterling's deviation. But we can only be said to deviate from an ideal if our nature is such that actually does participate in that ideal, but a material defect impedes our fulfillment of that nature. For example, if there were a woman who could not produce sperm, she would not be said to have a deviation, because the female nature is not such that it could produce sperm anyway. A man, however, who has low sperm count would be said to have a deviation, since his nature is such that it should have higher levels of sperm. If intersex were really a third sex, it would be redundant to say deviation, because it is precisely because we are either male or female that we can ever be said to deviate from typical male or female development. Next, regarding Leonard Sax's definition, my problem with his is that it is fundamentally rooted in phenotype, what we look like from the outside. Both of his qualifications for being intersex have to do with your genitalia. Genitalia is extremely important in determining sex, and is often the sole way which sex is determined. We need to remember that outward appearance is an effect of sex, not the cause. And we should define natural things not by what they look like, but by the function which their bodies are organized around the potential to perform. Say it again. When we define natural things, we should not define them by what they look like, but by the function which their bodies are organized around the potential to perform. So, while someone might look like they have both male and female genitalia, they would in fact not have both male and female genitalia because they will not produce both sperm and eggs. Referring to quote 9, true hermaphrodites possessing both sets of functional gonads and genitalia have never been observed in Homo sapiens, and multiple reviews have supported this conclusion. So, even if someone looks like they have both male and female genitalia, they will not be both a man and a woman because they cannot produce both. However, in the theoretical impossibility that this occurs, that would still not refute the binary. Quote 10 from John Skelko's essay, Why There Are Only Two Sexes, explains, even if we did discover an individual human being with both pairs of fully functioning sex organs, such a case would not disprove the binary distinction. Hermaphroditism, rather than disproving the traditional binary distinction, actually reinforces it. We would not even know hermaphrodites existed, let alone be able to speak of them, unless we knew of the male-female binary. So, you produce sperm, you're a man. You produce eggs, you're a woman. You can't produce both, but even if you could, that wouldn't disprove the binary. What about people who can produce neither, like Fausto Sterling? Or not like Fausto Sterling, like Maria Patino. She has no potential to produce either sperm or eggs. Perhaps the simplicity of the binary needs to be rejected in order to suffice for explaining every individual's sex. However, it would be more correct to define a man as a human individual who possesses the active potency to produce sperm, and a woman as a human individual who does not possess the active potency to produce sperm. In this way, the simplicity of the binary can be retained while sufficiently explaining each individual's sex. Now, this is not to say that producing eggs and having the ability to gestate new life is irrelevant to being a woman. That is far from the case. What I am saying, however, is that women should primarily be distinguished biologically from men by their inability to produce sperm, which should then trigger the ability to produce eggs and gestate new life. And when that triggering does not happen, there is a disorder. So Maria Patino suffers from a disorder of sex development, but that does not deny the fact that she is in fact a woman. Nor is this the first time that we have seen this method of describing female development. The lack of the SRY gene triggered the presence of ovaries. Furthermore, this method of definition is consistent in the way that Aristotle defines men and women in quote 2, and in which David Lefebvre explains in quote 11. He says that sometimes Aristotle opposes the capacity of the male to the incapacity of the female. Sometimes he attributes to both of them a capacity or a power. The male is characterized by a certain power, the female is characterized by an inability. But she also has a certain power, the power to generate in herself. It is the inability of the female that leads her to generate in herself and therefore to also have a particular capacity. So again, when this lack of potential does not trigger the presence of a potential, there would be a disorder. Furthermore, this method of definition is consistent with female biological development. Developmental biology textbooks refer to male differentiation as blocking or preventing female, implying that the female sex is the default and men need something extra to be men. This is explained in quote 12 by Carol Hooven in her book about testosterone. She says, the female duct system is the default and will develop without any specific hormonal stimulation, unlike the male duct system. Making a female in many ways is easier than making a male. The external structures develop in the female direction in the absence of any hormonal signal. So, to repeat, while the three definitions of male and female in the beginning were sufficient to explain normal sex development, they were insufficient to explain the sex of those who develop abnormally. But we can still retain the simplicity of the binary and the sufficiency of explaining everyone's sex by defining men as human individuals who possess the active potency to produce sperm, and women as human individuals who do not possess that active potency. And now this does not mean that if you bring any individual up to me or even up to any super smart scientist and will on the spot be able to tell you whether you're a man or a woman. There is the case of ambiguous genitalia. There are all of these really difficult situations in which it is hard to tell from a human's perspective. But I am claiming, though, that if you bring any individual up to me, I will in fact be able to tell you that they are either a man or a woman. And anyone who thinks that intersex is a valid third sex option has a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be male or female, which is rooted in the type of gamete which your body is or is not organized around the potential to produce. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. Wonderfully done. A lot of material there. Thank you, especially for helping us out with the visuals on the board. All right, I heard what I wanted to hear. And you said natures are defined by their function. Just for the sake of the general audience, could you give us another term in lieu of function?
Action, like potential to produce a certain thing.
Okay. Thinking whether final causality should be worked in here?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's another reason why I chose, or didn't choose, I found that gametes was the proper way to define male and female because all of this is ordered toward gamete production. And even phenotype is ordered toward gamete distribution or reception.
Gametes in turn are ordered towards reproduction.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
That was beautiful. That just seems very intuitively sound. Right? I have a couple of small questions and I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Jeb. The idea of active potency, the importance to which you attach to active potency, is that I assume that's an active potency in the normal case, that there would be exceptions where the active potency cannot, in fact, be realized.
Sure, it can never be fully actualized, but that active potency would, in fact, be there. It's the same in the case of a human being who has a mental disability where he or she will never be able to reason. They would still have the active potency, which makes them a human, even though they might never actually fully actualize that.
And what is that active potency rooted in?
In the gamete production?
Yeah, more philosophically, perhaps?
Yes, although ultimately rooted in our biology. So the active potency would come from having both the proper gonad that can create the gamete, but then also normal hormone levels and cell receptors is really the crux of it, because if you don't have properly shaped cell receptors, you have no active potency to produce sperm.
That's all in the order of material and formal causality, but maybe it's also rooted in final causality as well?
Sure, yeah, because for men, the circular shaped, we're not actually this analogy, circular shaped cell receptors would be ordered toward sperm production, male genitalia differentiation, but if they're not circular shaped, then they would not be ordered toward that.
Yeah. this is a minor point, is there any, what's the reason why we have a placeholder there in that one abnormal condition?
Sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's just called X. I just find it easier so that we have a visual placeholder and it emphasizes the fact that there's only one.
Another very minor question. Early on, you indicated that you were going to apply Occam's razor. Actually, I'm not remembering the exact case, and I guess the whole, in a way, the whole thesis is an application of Occam's. I take it you would not say that that's an absolute principle, though.
Yeah, I think there obviously are exceptions to that, but when defining natural things, if we can employ Occam's razor, we should.
It's often mistaken to be some kind of a metaphysical principle that
Sure.
cannot
Yeah,
but
for sure.
work, but it's only a rule of thumb, so to speak.
Mhm.
All right, good. I'll turn it over to Dr. Judd at this one.
Great, thank you, Joel. Yes, I also had some conversations with Pete a year ago about some of the situations that he has seen in his medical practice so far. And I had no idea how to answer him most of the time as far as the questions he was asking philosophically, is this person a man or a woman? And so thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot. And it's very helpful for sort of clarifying some of my thoughts on the topic. One question I got. Your conclusion is to say that the binary is the correct way to approach this question. On a logical level, to have a true binary, the two possibilities have to be exclusive of one another and exhaustive possibilities. So we're saying of all human beings, it's one of these two possibilities. Right, in logic, we would say like the two possibilities would need to be, for those conditions to be met, the two possibilities would have to be A or not A, which in our particular situation here would mean defining a woman as not a man.
Correct. Another way of saying it is that women are primarily defined as being human beings who don't do the things that men do, and men are human beings who do the things that men do.
Yeah, okay. It seems somewhat problematic to me in a number of ways. It's interesting, though, in the sense that you quote from JP2 at the beginning,
Yes.
and yet he also has Muliaris Dignitas, for example, right, in the dignity of woman.
Yeah.
And that almost seems contradictory to what you're saying, or even what he's saying here, of also affirming the binary in that respect, that the way to define a woman would be a human who is not a man. Can you say more?
Yeah. This was also Dr. Zepeda's main objection when I first introduced this definition. And yeah, that quote from John Paul II I absolutely love. And so yes, I essentially am saying that men are humans as extra things. But that obviously is just in the biological level. Like I said in the very beginning, it would be wrong to reduce what it means to be a man or a woman simply to our biological status. So, but the biological status is still the foundation. So I don't think that it poses any problem for the dignity of women or the equality of men and women to define them in this way. I think that Muliaris Dignitatem and all of the other beautiful writings on women are still applicable, even if biologically they should be distinguished in this way. But for all intents and purposes, I don't think it would be wrong to define women as human beings who have the active potency to produce eggs, because everyone, unless you have this condition, does. Or maybe some other that I'm not aware of. So, I mean, primarily referring to that active potency in women is also accurate. It is just is not as sufficient as it could be.
Thank you. Another question, sort of following up on Dr. Grove's question as well. When we say the active potency, it seems like, and I think you did talk about this in your thought, although it's still maybe not clear in my own mind. When you talk about the active potency, it seems like you could say at a variety of different levels, you have a kind of potency for it, or an active potency for it.
Yeah.
Whereas it seemed like you were ultimately coming down on the cell receptor being the central or the crucial part for saying whether they have an active potency or not. Why there instead of, say, the SRY, right, or some other level?
It especially seems like the organ level, the gonad level would be a nice place to start, right?
Right.
The gonad level. If you have testes, those are for something. Pretty
Right.
obviously.
Yeah.
Right. Or why not go all the way back to the karyotype? Obviously, there's different situations, but
Great question. Partially because of Dr. Grove's comment about final causality. Having certain chromosomes and certain genes on those chromosomes and certain gonads and certain cell receptors is all for the sake of gamete production. And so it would be more proper to define things by their final cause and what their goal is than by an intermediate step. Also because the active potency to have SRY might not actually happen, and you might lack that despite the Y chromosome. And so then there's been cases of XY individuals naturally having children because they lack the SRY gene and they didn't even know that they were XY karyotype until getting genetically tested later. So any other step along the way would pose problems like that. To Dr. Zepeda's point about the gonads, so gonads primarily produce gametes. However, the gonads of someone with androgen insensitivity are not strictly speaking gametes or not strictly speaking testes, because they don't actually do the testes thing. They don't have any potential to do the testes thing. In the same way that like a dead person's brain is still like a brain, but not actually, because it has zero potential to ever exercise its function, as opposed to someone who has a mental defect, like a brain that has the potential to still function as a brain despite the fact that it never will. So the gonads of someone who has no active potency to produce a gamete is more like the brain of a dead person. And the gonads of someone whose active potency is impeded, such as in Klinefelter syndrome, that's what happens. They have male genitalia, but extremely low sperm count. They would still have testes because they have that active potency despite the fact that it's severely impeded.
Yeah, can I ask about that? So you're saying that, let's say you have testes and something's impeding them, then they're not really testes? Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
going back to
not quite. Let me refine. Not impeding, but making them basically have a different nature or function. Like the function of the testes of someone with androgen sensitivity is not the function of a man without, who has regular testes. The testes in people with CIIS are often cancerous and need to be removed. They are producing tons of hormones that the body isn't using, and it's very controversial as to whether they should be removed automatically, but so they don't even do the same thing that testes do in men. So it's not quite that they're impeded, because that word impede is similar to privation, implies that underlying nature, so they would be a man. So I would say that their testes they perform the same outward appearance, you might say, of male testes, but they don't actually have the potential to do that function.
I'm kind of struck by the example you just gave of the brain and how that makes sense, right? That you have a brain, if it doesn't really have sort of maybe the right environment of being in a living body, it's not really a brain. But if we think of people who have defects, right, when it comes to that organ, we could have somebody who is fully human, right, but doesn't even have that organ, right? Or
A human being who doesn't have a brain.
early in development, right?
Well, okay, there's a difference there though.
Okay, yeah, can you explain?
Sure. So it's about final causality ultimately, and also, like this is a common argument in like the whole pro-life movement. It's like, oh, they don't even have a brain until 6 weeks, so just you can kill them before then. But your body is organized around the potential to perform a function, and the level of functioning that is required for a human being those first 6 weeks does not need a brain. You can do the human thing of being organized around the potential to reason for those first 6 weeks without one. It's only when you need one that your body produces one. So, and even when they don't have a brain yet, they have the active potency to develop one, which is not the case in a dead person's brain or a brain removed from somebody's head.
Could I ask a question related to that? Would that then mean if we're putting a cell receptor, that is sort of the level for determining, would that mean that prior to the development of such cell receptors in a human person early on in development, they're neither male nor female?
Great question. No, because that's established at conception. Your DNA is established at conception, and your DNA contains the genes which encode for your cell receptors. So from the moment of conception, you either have or do not have the proper cells.
Let me ask one other question on a different part of your argument. You talk about, you apply to Fausto Sterling's definition of intersex by saying, look, she's talking about typical people and deviations from those. Like, what if she just used a different word and just said things that are different from these things that we're used to?
That would be an option. Ultimately, I would not necessarily refute the terminology of her definition, but the organization of the body, because clearly something naturally is being impeded in any of those differences that she might mention. So she might say, oh, it's just a difference in hormonal levels that causes a woman to have an enlarged clitoris that looks more like a man. Like, that might be a difference, but ultimately you can tell from the organization of the body that her levels of producing too much testosterone is impeding her in some way, and that same predation principle would apply, because her excess testosterone would impede fertility, which is obviously a deprivation in a human being.
Can we open it up? Questions from the audience?
Dr. Costa.
I'm going to ask you to try to translate this into public policy. Not a hypothetical. There was a bill in the Wyoming legislature last year that failed that was attempting to regulate biologically male participation in female sports. I believe it's been reintroduced this year. If you had the ear of the legislators, what would you do? Is there a simple and sufficient test, not definition, but actual way of testing or a series of tests that could be applied to solve this this public dispute? And at which level would you be testing, or which levels would you be testing? And do we have the technology to do that?
Yeah, great question. So, yes, we have the technology to do it in most every circumstance. For all intents and purposes, all that would be required. So Ann Fausto Sterling's 1.7% applies to everything in red, but 1.5 of that 1.7% is simply conditions in which women produce too much testosterone. So 0.2% are actually those would be the problematic ones, or it might not be easy to define immediately. But so for 99.8% of the population, testing on the chromosomal level and also maybe doing some kind of ultrasound to determine what kind of gonads they have would be absolutely sufficient. And then for individuals who seem problematic, that they might fall into the 0.2%. I don't know quite the science behind it, but I'm sure there's a way that you can determine whether they're producing sperm or eggs if they aren't doing so, obviously. But for 99.8% of the population, karyotype tests and gonad ultrasounds would be sufficient.
So for the larger number, the smaller number, is that 1.5%, the women producing too much testosterone, would you argue that those women those are women, therefore they should participate in sports,
Oh, sure.
women's sports.
Yeah, I mean, it depends, like, private individual organizations have the right to have other qualifications more than male and female. So if their only qualification is women or men, that's all, then yeah, because like.
Civil rights laws kind of destroyed the ability of private organizations to regulate their membership in that way. But it would be nice if they did have.
Like, in theory, if they wanted to say only women who have X amount of testosterone can play, that would be probably controversial to some, but technically not denying the fact that women who produce excess levels of testosterone are female. But a famous case of Castro Semenya, she was an Olympic athlete recently, I think 2009, who was a track athlete, and she had a very deep voice, very muscular body, and she was questioned for potentially being biologically male. And no, she had XX chromosomes and ovaries, but she produced a lot of testosterone, which gave her an advantage, but she was still female, so I don't think it was right to make her leave.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I may have missed something here, Joe, but is it too much of a simplification to say that it boils down to why or not why?
Can you say a little bit more?
If you got why, you should be following into the meeting.
Yes, that would be an oversimplification because some Y chromosomes don't have the SY gene, and then ovaries develop. And there have been individuals with Y chromosomes who get pregnant and are regular females. Dr. Olson.
First, a really dumb question.
Sure.
If I take a male and if I remove his testes, do I have a woman?
Absolutely not.
Explain.
I'd like you to say why, but if I take a male and I remove his SRY, do I have a woman?
No.
Can I take a male and do anything material? This is not a practical question. Does it amount to a material difference?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I thought about that a ton, and ultimately it's the distinction between acquired and inherent potential. So I can say that I am a flying animal because I have the acquired potential to ride an airplane. But that does not make me a flying animal because that's not inherent in my nature, but it's acquired. It's the same argument for why you can't change your sex by taking extra hormones or anything because that's all acquired, not inherent. And so if the SRY gene were inherent in your nature as a XY chromosome individual, then no matter how many times you try to take it out, which would literally be impossible to kill a person, but in theory, you would not make that person a woman since male and female are about natures and natures are about intrinsic, not acquired.
So, the moment of conception, you tinker and you break the SRY.
Mm-hmm.
You at the instant creation of conception, you had a man, but then you have after that a broken man.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't call the broken man a woman. Is that right?
No, we don't call broken man a woman.
Broken man will develop ovaries and present as a woman.
So that's one of those situations which we would never know about because we can't go back to the moment of conception. So,
Like I said, it's not a practical question. I just want to know.
in theory, if this were to
is
happen,
female something that's immaterial, or is it in the stuff?
no, it's in the stuff. It's in the stuff that makes you a human being, but a human being that doesn't produce sperm. So, I mean, obviously, like your question would provide a lot of theoretical like complications, and so in theory, if at the moment of conception everything were fine and the active potency to produce sperm and do all the regular man things were there, and then like a weird photon hit your zygote and like destroyed all the SRY. That would be a similar circumstance as a man who after birth decides to change all of his cells and develop ovaries and get pregnant. Like it would be equivalent to that, but we wouldn't treat him or her that way because we just wouldn't know. And this could also get into a sex and gender distinction, which is a whole other topic, but I didn't really go into that. So. Marcel.
So on a medical level, is there a surgical process that you can remove one or the other, or leave the individual as is?
Remove one or the other gonad?
Correct.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when you have, it's very rare, and there's only been like 500 documented cases in all of history in which someone has both one testis and one ovary. And in the cases that this person has a definitive sex, and it is usually male because the testes wouldn't produce unless the SRY gene are present. And the only cases I've even heard of are with men or boys who had breast enlargement or other things, and then they realized that they had one of each. But yeah, so the ovary would usually be removed since that would be semi-cancerous, and then they might supplement with extra testosterone that the other testis wouldn't be producing. So, great question. Mm-hmm. Anthony.
I would like to thank you for being very Aristotelian. I'm going to be Aristotelian for a couple seconds here. So when he talks about genus and species, he usually or at least when he talks about natures, he usually talks about how do you determine a nature is you grab genuses and then you grab a specific difference, and one thing has a specific difference and the other one doesn't, and that's how you get your two species. So my question is, why aren't men and women different species?
Phenomenal question. I will refer you to book 9 of the Metaphysics. Firstly, Aristotle has a complete paragraph describing why men and women are not different species, and I will try to explain that as best as I can, adding some extra input from William Newton in the essay that I referred to in quote 3. So, men and women are not different species. So, species are differentiated by different powers. And so it does seem compelling to say that men and women are different species because they have different powers. However, ultimately, I'm arguing, and William Newton also argues, that there is a single bipotential reproductive power that is accidentally differentiated in 2 ways. So that men and women would not be distinct species, but men and women would be 2 mutually exclusive, inseparable accidents within the single human species. And Aristotle even refers to the act of sexual reproduction as a single act similar to plants asexually reproducing, because at the moment of reproduction, the man and the woman are doing the same action and have the same power to produce. So they would not be distinct species.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
I know this wasn't quite your focus. I don't know if it was, you talked about this in your thesis or anything, but I was wondering, a lot of people seem to think that this level of like scientific clarity is, or like will be enough to resolve the confusion around like gender identity and just like masculinity and femininity.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're like beyond that for like the science to be like enough to resolve those issues. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on like that, like how that can inform or the current confusion around that identity.
That's a great question. So it's similar to what I said in the beginning about how understanding this is at the root of understanding other issues regarding the sexes. So that includes gender identity, sex versus gender distinction, transgenderism, all of that stuff. But ultimately, it has to do with the fact that the physical reflects the non-physical. And that the way our bodies are organized have to do with our souls. And while men and women wouldn't have different souls that would make them different species, the way that our bodies are organized reflect the way we should identify ourselves as. And so someone who has a disconnect between their gender identity and their biology may say biology doesn't cover it, but they need to remember that the matter reflects the form. In the same way, this isn't like the most convincing argument, but Aquinas talks about how the placement of man's head on top of the rest of his body implies the primacy of his reason. And so that's a material explanation for why we are rational animals, because our head is prioritized. So in the same way, if a human who thinks he's a cat, which unfortunately is becoming all too common, you would say, well, your body is not, it doesn't look like a cat. And so even if you don't feel like you're a cat, or even if you don't feel like you're a human, you are, because your body is a human, your body reflects your soul. So I would say the same thing to men and women who have gender dysphoria and who are having a disconnect between their body and what they feel like their body should be, because the material fundamentally reflects the spiritual.
I guess, sorry, I agree with all of that, and like probably most people here would too. But I guess my concern is more like I don't see how that that line of argumentation can reach people sort of like on the other side, where it's like.
I think it's difficult, especially when people think so differently. One thing that you might be able to just find some common ground on is like, do you think things have purpose? And if they say no, you have to really get them some help, but you have to find common ground somewhere, and somehow around like purpose of physical things, you have to say, do things have order? Do they have things that they should do? Like, does the word should even mean anything to you? Like, you can just start like very fundamental level and then work up. Dr. Schubert.
Jill, my question is coming from the genesis of gender, where Favale argues that, similarly to you, right, that the distinction between men and women is rooted in the body, right? This is a biological and scientific definition. But then she extrapolates from that, right, because she's got this idea, or a pretty standard idea, right, that the to be an embodied thing is not really right to be a body, right, but that the body is a sort of sign of something for her, right, a sign of spiritual reality. Right? And from that, then starting to, she makes claims about what the female body represents, what the male body represents. So what I'm curious about with your definition, right, of male and female, right, is that the symbolic level? Do you think, right, is it wise, just, prudent, true, right, to draw symbolic meaning from the definition, right, of the woman as that being whose body, right, is organized in such a way that it doesn't produce sperm, right? Like, should we draw kind of like symbolic conclusions from that, or should we be very careful about that?
I think we always need to be careful about drawing symbolic conclusions from matter, although obviously they can be. So I think yes, like Favale, all of the things that she said about women could be said, including with my definition. And so if we're trying to read into the definition and say, oh, you think that like women are defective men, that's the symbolism behind the definition, I obviously wouldn't agree with that. But fundamentally, I think you might be able to pull some symbolism from the default being female, and men having this extra power that they do this thing with that women can't do, but how female is kind of like the foundation. Maybe you can grab some kind of symbolic reasoning from that.
Why would that be better?
Better than defining them by egg production?
Or, sorry, the symbolic meaning from the lack
of well, I guess the way of phrasing the word defective man makes women seem like they're lacking something essential. but by saying that women are like the foundation, which the other sex is built upon, seems to be more, in my mind, reverential to the dignity of women than saying that they be defective.
Okay, can we take one more question?
Gregory.
Can you briefly clarify why men are defined by their active potential and women by their absence and not the other way around?
Yes, primarily because